History is filled with tales of ambition, betrayal, and forbidden power. Kingdoms have risen and fallen on the strength of rulers who dared to defy tradition. But hidden among the chronicles of time, a story so disturbing, so scandalous, that even scribes and priests tried to bury it forever. It is the story of a queen whose hunger for authority crossed every moral boundary, a scandal too shocking even for history itself. She was a woman of extraordinary beauty and unmatched influence, a queen who ruled not just her throne, but the hearts and fears of her subjects. Her reign began with promise, as she sought to preserve her dynasty and protect her fragile kingdom from rivals eager to tear it apart. But as years passed, her ambition grew into obsession. She believed only she could preserve the line of kings, and then came her son, the heir, the living symbol of her dynasty's future. Groomed for greatness, adored by the people, and guided at every step by his mother, he was destined to inherit the crown. But the bond between mother and child grew far darker than anyone could imagine. Whispers turned into rumors, and rumors into scandal. At last, the unimaginable happened. A queen who did the unthinkable, marrying her own son. Was it desperation to keep power? A twisted interpretation of divine will? Or something far more sinister? This is not just the tale of a forbidden marriage. It is the unraveling of a dynasty, and a secret history that the world was never meant to know. When we think of queens, history often paints them into extremes. Either the noble guardians of kingdoms, remembered for their grace and wisdom, or the ruthless schemers who ruled with an iron fist. But in the case of this queen, she was both admired and feared, celebrated and despised. To understand how she came to commit the unthinkable, we must first step into the world she was born into. Her kingdom was not a land of peace and prosperity. It was a fractured realm, surrounded by rivals and torn apart by internal struggles. Thrones in such times were never safe. Kings died young, sometimes in battle, sometimes by poison, sometimes by daggers hidden in the dark. In this world, survival required not just power, but cunning. And from the very beginning, this queen proved she had both. Born into nobility, she was raised in the very heart of politics. Unlike many royal women of her time, she was not content with embroidery, music, or quiet devotion to the gods. She had a sharp mind and a natural ability to command respect. Those who met her often described her presence as magnetic. A woman whose eyes seemed to pierce through lies and whose voice carried authority even in the presence of seasoned generals. When she ascended to the throne, whether through marriage or inheritance, she quickly revealed that she was not going to be a passive ruler. She became a force at court, maneuvering through alliances and conspiracies with an intelligence that astonished even her enemies. Some whispered that the gods themselves had favored her, granting her charisma and power. Others muttered in private that she was dangerous, too ambitious, too willing to bend sacred laws in the name of survival. The queen's reign began with hope. She restructured the court, rewarded loyal nobles, and punished those who dared to betray her. She ensured that her kingdom's armies were fed, armed, and paid. Her people, at least for a while, respected her as the savior of a fragile dynasty. Yet, beneath this glittering facade, the seeds of scandal were already being sown. For though she wore the crown, she knew that her power was only as strong as her bloodline. Dynasties lived and died on succession. Without a legitimate heir, a kingdom could collapse into civil war within months. And so, when she gave birth to a son, it was more than a moment of joy. It was salvation. The infant was seen as the embodiment of hope, the promise that her dynasty would live on. The bond between mother and son began in those early years. As all royal children were raised under the shadow of political danger, she protected him fiercely, keeping him close, shielding him not just from assassins and rivals, but even from the influence of other members of the court. Some say that she was overly protective, that she allowed no one else to guide him, not tutors, not generals, not priests. From the beginning, he was hers alone, her creation, her heir, her mere dot. As the boy grew, so too did her control over him. She arranged his lessons, dictated the myths and histories he studied, and handpicked the commanders who trained him in the arts of war. To the outside world, this seemed like the careful nurturing of a queen who wanted the best for her child. But behind the palace walls, courtiers whispered uneasily. They saw not a boy becoming his own man, but a boy becoming an extension of his mother's will. What made her so determined? Some believe it was fear. The fear of losing power. The fear of being replaced by ambitious nobles if her son ever chose independence. Others believe it was pride, that she saw herself not only as his mother, but as his divine destiny. A woman who would shape the king of the future exactly in her image. Whatever the truth, the queen stood above all. She was not simply a mother or a ruler. She was a master of fate, bending tradition and expectation to her own vision. At this stage of her reign, no one could imagine the scandal that lay ahead, but those who looked closely might have seen the first signs: the isolation of the boy, the possessiveness of the mother, the dangerous merging of dynasty and desire. History remembers her as the queen who married her own son, but before that act, she was something even more chilling, a ruler who believed that not even the natural laws of family, morality, or the gods could limit her power. She was a queen above all, and above all others she would remain, until her choices brought the kingdom to the edge of ruin. Every dynasty rests on one fragile promise: the birth of an heir. Without one, kingdoms crumble, noble families rise in rebellion, and foreign powers descend like vultures on a wounded crown. For this queen, the birth of her son was more than a moment of celebration. It was the very lifeline of her reign. He was not just her child, he was her salvation. From the moment of his birth, the young prince was treated as a symbol, not as an ordinary child. The kingdom's priests declared his arrival to be blessed by the gods. Poets and scribes wrote verses celebrating him as the dawn of a new age. The people saw him as proof that the dynasty would endure. Yet behind the celebration, there was always the queen. She was not merely his mother. She was the architect of his destiny. Unlike other princes of his time, who were raised by a collection of tutors, advisors, and military commanders, this boy's life was shaped almost entirely by his mother's hand. She decided what he would learn, which myths he would hear, and which men he would be allowed to admire. Every story of great kings from the past, every tale of war and glory, was filtered through her voice. He did not simply inherit a crown, he inherited her will. At first, this seemed like devotion, the natural instinct of a protective mother. The palace had always been a place of betrayal, where rivals could poison a child as easily as they could stab a king. Perhaps, the queen believed, only by keeping him close could she ensure his survival. But as the boy grew older, whispers began to circulate. Courtiers noticed how rarely he was seen apart from her, how he looked to her before speaking, how her approval or disapproval dictated his every word. His tutors, when permitted, found themselves limited. Any lesson that did not suit the queen's vision was discarded. Military commanders complained quietly that the boy was trained not as a soldier of his own making, but as a reflection of his mother's ambition. Even priests found themselves pushed aside, their influence curtailed by the queen's relentless grip over the child's spiritual education. Yet the boy himself was not weak. Accounts suggest he was intelligent, quick-witted, and naturally charismatic. He had the makings of a ruler who could inspire loyalty and lead armies. But the closer he came to manhood, the clearer it became that he was caught in a web of dependence. He could speak as a prince, but he could not think beyond his mother's shadow. As he grew older, the dynamic between them deepened into something that unsettled even the most loyal of courtiers. The queen showered him with affection, but it was an affection tinged with possessiveness. She praised him in public, but in private, she reminded him constantly that his throne, his crown, and even his life belonged to her. In his victories, she claimed credit. In his failures, she shielded him. The people adored their young heir, but even they began to notice the unusual bond. Songs of his greatness were often paired with verses praising his mother. Foreign envoys reported home with strange observations. that the boy and the queen shared not just a political partnership, but something far more personal. Rumors spread that she was preparing him not as her successor, but as her equal, as if no one else could ever share her throne or her bed of power. In a world where kingship was both sacred and dangerous, this was alarming. The son was meant to grow into independence, to embody the strength of a new generation. Instead, he remained tethered, unable to step beyond the boundaries his mother had drawn for him. And so the heir to the throne became more than a prince. He became a reflection of a queen's obsession, the living proof of her desire to mold the kingdom in her own image. He was not raised to rule, he was raised to serve her ambition. This bond, stronger than any court could be. Every palace has secrets. In the shadows of golden halls and behind the curtains of silk-draped chambers, whispers thrive. At first, they are nothing more than murmurs, soft, fleeting, easy to ignore. But whispers have a way of growing, and in this queen's court, they soon became impossible to silence. By the time the young prince reached manhood, courtiers began to notice what they dared not say aloud. He was never truly alone. Wherever he went, the queen was close behind. At feasts, she sat beside him, her gaze fixed upon him more than upon the nobles who toasted their dynasty. At ceremonies, when he was presented as the heir, it was her voice that guided his speeches. Even in moments meant for the bond between ruler and people, her presence overshadowed his. At first, these peculiarities were explained away. A mother's devotion, said the priests. A careful guardian, said the scribes. But servants, guards, and foreign envoys whispered differently. They saw the touches linger too long, the glances too intense, the control too absolute. In a world where bloodlines were sacred and family was protected by divine law, the bond between mother and son seemed to step closer and closer to the forbiddance. Foreign ambassadors, always eager to find weaknesses, reported home in coded messages. Some described the relationship uncomfortably close. Others dared to suggest that the queen intended to make her son just her successor, but her partner in ways the court could not imagine. Rival kings and rulers used these rumors to their advantage, spreading stories of corruption and unnatural love to tarnish the dynasty's image. Inside the palace walls, fear grew. Few dared to speak openly, for the queen's wrath was legendary. Those who opposed her influence often found themselves stripped of titles, exiled, or worse. Yet even silence could not stop the gossip. In hushed tones, servants passed stories. Did the queen visit her son's chambers late at night? Did she forbid him from marrying foreign princesses who might dilute her control? Did she believe, as some whispered, that their bond was blessed by the gods themselves? Religion, of course, made the scandal even more dangerous, for in nearly every ancient faith, incest was seen as the gravest sin, a violation of natural law, an insult to the gods who shaped mankind. Priests squirmed at the rumors, unsure whether to confront her or to preserve their own lives by looking away. Some chose to reinterpret the old laws, suggesting that perhaps divine rulers lived above morality. Others condemned her in secret, fearing the queen's hand, but fearing the gods even more. The prince, meanwhile, became an object of pity as much as scandal. Was he complicit, a willing participant in his mother's ambitions, or was he a prisoner, trapped in a bond he could not escape? Courtiers argued in whispers, historians speculated centuries later, but the truth remains hidden in shadows. What is certain is that his identity was blurred. He was no longer just the heir to the throne. He was the center of a forbidden relationship that cast a shadow across the entire dynasty. As rumors spread, trust in the monarchy weakened. Nobles who once pledged loyalty began to wonder if they served a sacred crown or a cursed throne. Foreign rulers mocked the kingdom as a land ruled by unnatural love, and within the palace, an air of unease grew heavy. Yet the queen did nothing to quiet the whispers. If anything, her actions seemed to defy them, as though she dared anyone to question her. Perhaps she believed herself untouchable, chosen by destiny to reshape the very laws of men and gods. Or perhaps she simply did not care, Blinded by ambition and obsession alike, the scandal had not yet erupted, but the stage was set. In the great halls of her court, under the gaze of priests and nobles, whispers turned into dread. Everyone knew a storm was coming, and when it arrived, it would shatter every boundary of power, of morality, and of history itself. Whispers can be ignored, rumors can be denied, but when scandal is sealed in ritual and written in law, it becomes impossible to erase. What had once been speculation in the Queen's court was about to erupt into open reality, for the Queen had made her decision. Her son would not only be her heir, he would be her husband. The very idea was unthinkable. Across the ancient world, marriage was more than a union of two people. It was a bond sanctified by gods, witnessed by priests, and legitimized before the eyes of an entire kingdom. To defy its rules was to defy heaven itself. Yet the Queen was determined. Some say she saw this union as the ultimate way to keep power within her grasp. Others suggest she believed her dynasty's bloodline was too sacred to be mingled with outsiders. Whatever her reasoning, she prepared the ceremony in secret, and when the day came, the world stood stunned. Accounts differ on how the marriage was presented. Some historians suggest it was disguised as a symbolic rite, a ritual meant to portray the unity of crown and heir. Others insist it was declared openly, a shocking proclamation that the Queen and her son would rule as husband and wife. But one truth is certain. In the moment their union was formalized, the kingdom crossed a line it could never retreat from. The reaction was immediate. Nobles were horrified. Priests struggled to justify the marriage under divine law. Some chose silence, too fearful to challenge the Queen directly. Others whispered rebellion. Among the people, confusion reigned. Some accepted the Queen's words that their bond was divinely sanctioned, that their dynasty was chosen to transcend mortal laws. Others muttered that a curse had fallen upon their land. Foreign powers seized upon the scandal. Ambassadors carried the news to distant courts, where it was retold with shock and disgust. Rivals mocked the kingdom as corrupt and cursed. Enemies whispered that the gods themselves would punish such arrogance. Even allies hesitated, fearful of being tainted by association. The Queen had not only shaken her own court, she had scandalized the world. But for the Queen, the marriage was triumph. At last, she had secured her son completely. No foreign princess could claim him. No noble family could tie him to their bloodline. No rival could weaken her grip on the throne. Through marriage, she ensured that her power would remain absolute, woven into the very fabric of the dynasty's future. And what of the son? Was he a willing participant in this forbidden union, or a prisoner bound by loyalty and fear? Accounts conflict. Some portray him as weak, unable to resist the will of the woman who had shaped his life from birth. Others suggest he embraced the marriage, convinced by his mother that they were chosen by the gods. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between. A young man torn between devotion and horror, duty and shame. The forbidden marriage was more than a personal scandal. It tore at the very heart of the kingdom. Every law, every tradition, every sacred teaching had been bent to serve the Queen's will, and once broken, those bonds could never be restored. The dynasty's moral foundation cracked, and though the Queen still sat upon her throne, shadows gathered around her. The court was no longer merely whispering. Now it plotted. Nobles who had once feared her began to dream of her downfall. Priests who had bent their sermons began to pray for her judgment. Enemies who had once trembled before her armies now smelled blood. The Queen believed she had secured her legacy. In truth, she had sealed her fate, for in trying to bind her son to herself forever, she had bound her dynasty to scandal and ruin. And as history would soon reveal, no empire, no crown, and no queen can escape the weight of such forbidden love. The forbidden marriage was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a slow unraveling, for no throne, no dynasty, and no crown can withstand the weight of scandal this great. Once the vows were spoken and the union sealed, the kingdom could no longer pretend. What had once been whispers and rumors had now become undeniable truth. carved into the heart of history. The court was the first to fracture. Nobles who had endured the Queen's rule out of fear began to see opportunity in her weakness. If she had crossed the line of morality so openly, then surely the gods would punish her. Rival factions grew bold, meeting in secret, planning her downfall. Some plotted to assassinate her, others to elevate another noble to the throne, one who could restore dignity to the kingdom. Yet even in rebellion, they feared her, for her intelligence and ruthless nature were undiminished. The priests, too, faced an impossible choice. For years, they had legitimized the crown as sacred, blessed by the divine, but now the crown itself was tainted. Some priests declared the Queen an abomination, accusing her of violating natural law. Others bent their sermons to justify her rule, insisting that divine rulers stood above human morality. But even their voices trembled with uncertainty. Faith itself was shaken, and the people could see it. And what of the people? Among them, confusion reigned. Some clung to the Queen's narrative, that she and her son were chosen by the gods to preserve the dynasty's bloodline. But many more turned to anger. Markets, once filled with gossip, now seized with open condemnation. Farmers cursed the throne, soldiers muttered about dishonor, and foreign traders carried the scandal beyond the kingdom's borders. The Queen had not just betrayed her people, she had humiliated them before the eyes of the world. Foreign powers rejoiced. Enemies who once trembled before her armies now mocked her kingdom as cursed and corrupt. They spread tales of incest and sin, fueling rebellions at her borders and encouraging rivals to strike. History often celebrates kings and queens as symbols of power, wisdom, and divine right. But sometimes history leaves behind shadows, stories so dark, so unsettling, that even time itself tries to erase them. The tale of the Queen, who married her own son, is one such shadow. She was a woman of immense ambition, a ruler who believed she could bend not only men and kingdoms, but even the laws of nature and the will of the gods. In her eyes, the marriage was not scandal, but strategy, a way to preserve her dynasty, to keep her power unchallenged. Yet, in doing so, she crossed a line that no throne could justify. Her son, the prince who should have been the kingdom's future, became instead the symbol of its downfall. Was he complicit or a victim? History cannot say with certainty. What we do know is that their union shattered the trust of their people, weakened their kingdom, and condemned their dynasty to infamy. Today, fragments of her story survive only in whispers, in half-buried chronicles and forgotten accounts. Perhaps that was deliberate, an attempt to erase her shame. But even erased stories leave scars, and this scar reminds us that the pursuit of absolute power can corrupt not just rulers, but the very foundations of family, morality, and faith. The Queen sought to rule forever. Instead, she became a legend of scandal, a tale too shocking for a history to forgive, but too powerful to forget.